All right, it looks like it's time, so let's get started. We're happy to have our second keynote of the day today, the second to last day of the conference. So here to join us is Avinatan Hassidim. Avinatan is a professor of computer science at Bar Ilan University, and he's also director at Google Research, where he leads the Israel Research Group. Avinatan has done a lot of really amazing work on matching and mechanism design. In addition to a lot of the theoretical work that we're aware of, he's also done a lot of impactful work in Israel in medical intern lotteries, in the psychology match, and the lawyers match, and a lot of really direct applicable work that has been really interesting to see unfold over the years. Avinatan's group also has done a lot of work on flood forecasting and a lot of other research that his research at Google has done. And for this, he's won numerous awards, including the Editor's Choice PRL in 2010, Best Paper Awards at Sigmetrics in 2011, and a bunch of other awards as well. And so very excited to have Avinatan. Thank you for joining us, and take it away from here.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the great conference, and thanks for the lovely introduction. Okay, so I want to tell you about what happens when people go to school and schools have funding. And this is going to be the topic of this talk. I'm going to start from the very beginning, but you're going to see that crazy things happen. This is based on joint works with Peter Barreau, Asaf Rom, Ran Shorer, and Sandor Savadro. Okay, so let me start with a simple theoretical model. Okay, so we're going to have colleges, and each college has a number of seats, and each college has a ranking over all the students. And colleges want to recruit the best students they can under the capacity constraints, right? This is what we're all used to for the university. We want to get the best class of students that we can get. And this is a classical problem, right? I mean, in 1962, Gale and Shapley already studied it. And there are also a ton of very important results. The main one is probably the student proposing deferred acceptance is stable and strategy proof. And don't worry about this because I'm going to explain everything here. Okay, so basically what we want to do is we want to try to solve this problem mathematically. Okay, we want to find an algorithmic solution which would allocate students to schools in a smart way. What is the most important thing that we want out of our solutions? Basically, if there is somebody who tells me to go to a school, right? There is some algorithm which tells me, you know, go study at MIT. And I really want to go to Stanford. And Stanford would actually admit me if I would go there. That's a problem, right? Because I would just go to Stanford and not to MIT. And the solution that I was told, I'm not going to respect what I was told, right? I'm going to do something else. And then, you know, maybe Stanford are going to accept me, so they're going to accept somebody else. And then somebody else doesn't have a place to study, and everything breaks loose. So the main thing that we want, the most basic thing that we want out of any solution to this market, to this question of who should study where, is stability. If I am told to go to a school, then no other school that I want will accept me. Okay, if I prefer any other school to the school that I went to, they just don't want to accept me. They have better students I like more, and therefore I basically have to go to where I'm told. I'm going to state something which is slightly more general, but you know, you can also think about what I said and it's going to be enough. What we're going to say is that if there is like a set of agents who can improve their situations such that everybody gets better, then it's a problem, right? Because they can just do it, and you know the solution is going to break. In our setting of deferred acceptance, the set of stable matching, so all the solutions where this cannot happen, is also called the core, and we're going to talk about this some more. Okay, so stable matchings are critical for the success of centralized marketplaces. And they're also very good to predict what is going to happen in a decentralized market, right? I mean, this notion of stability is so natural that you usually also get it if you don't do anything, right? You're going to get to some solution which is stable in the end. Again, if the solution is unstable, you know, if I'm accepted to the wrong university, I can always call everybody else and say, oh, I can go there, why not? Okay, now the first question is, can you find a stable matching? And the answer is yes, and this is the Gale-Shapley algorithm from 1962. That Shapley also won a Nobel Prize for. And here's how it goes. Imagine here that our students are Alex, So they usually like given names of like boys and girls, but it doesn't really matter. You can think of it as students. So we have the students, Alex, Ben, Carl, and Dan, and the schools are Erica, Fatma, Gwen, and Henrietta. And we have scores. So Alex prefers Erica, then Fatma, then Henrietta, and then Gwen. Ben has 1, 2, 3, 4. Carl and Dan, and also the schools have preferences over the students, right? So for example, Erica, her top choice is Carl, her second top choice is Dan, then Ben, and the last choice is Alex. So the deferred acceptance algorithm works as follows. You can imagine that it works in days, even though these are virtual days, nothing really happens. And in the first day, every student goes to the school they prefer the most. So Alex goes to Erica, Ben and Carl go to Gwen, and Dan goes to Henrietta. And now if the school can only, imagine the school can only accept one student. So if a school has 2 students, they basically tentatively pick one of them and send the other one to look for a different school. So in this case, Gwen gets 2 applicants, Ben and Carl, and says, Ben, you're not going to study here because Gwen prefers Carl. So what happens in the next day is everybody who already has an allocation stays there, but Ben has to try a new allocation. So he goes to Henrietta University, and Henrietta now has 2 applicants, Ben and Dan. And Henrietta now prefers Dan, so now Ben is going to stay in Henrietta, and Dan is going to leave and look for another university. Okay. I'm sorry. Henrietta prefers Dan, not Ben, so Ben has to look for another university, so Ben goes to a third choice. This is Erica. Here, Erica has now Alex and Ben. Erica prefers Ben to Alex, so Alex needs to go to a second choice, which is Fatma University. And now every student goes to university. Every university has 1 applicant. So we basically finalize this, and this is going to be the final outcome, right? So we've admitted students to universities in a way which is stable. Okay, and this is going to be the final outcome, and you can see that this matching is stable. So no student would ever want to leave. And again, if we think of them as boys and girls, this is the stable matching, which is least preferred by all women, right? So you can see that the boys are pretty happy, but the girls are not so happy. They get low choices. And we want to translate this into universities and college, and this has been done actually by Al Roth when he designed the NRMP match, so matching American physicians into residencies. And basically what he said is that matching theory, so this theoretical result about boys and girls can actually inform market design, so we can actually use this to get from students to schools, and that stability is important. It has been shown that deferred acceptance is strategy proof for the proposing side. So if you note the story that we had before, the boys and girls was not symmetric. The boys first went to their first choice, and the girls had to choose among the boys who went there. So this is strategy proof for the proposing side, so for the boys, but not for the girls. The main thing we want to do, we want to translate this from an imaginary story about boys and girls to a real story about students and colleges is, and this is the important insight, we want the students to be the proposing side because we want them to benefit, so we want them to propose to the colleges, and then the colleges can accept the subset of the students who propose and say, out of the set of students who propose, this is the subset I want, and the rest are going to propose to something else. This is just one example. This is the matching that we've done, the psychology match that we had in Israel. You don't have to read everything. The only thing that matters is there's a GUI, and this is what the students see. And they actually drag and drop here whatever programs that they want. And we actually run deferred acceptance, and this is actually working and admitting students to psychology programs in Israel. Okay, so now I want to go back to the core. Which is going to be the topic of this talk. The core is the set of all stable matchings. And what we want to say about the core is that in general, for deferred acceptance, it is not necessarily unique. It is never empty because deferred acceptance finds at least one matching, which is in the core, a stable outcome. But recent studies suggest that the core is typically small. So there are not many possible stable matchings. And when I say recent studies, what I mean, so the first thing is in the NRMP, in the first match between American physicians and residencies, Roth and Purinson designed the match. found out that there are actually not that many stable matchings. So they did some computer programming to find the set of all possible stable matchings, and they didn't find very many, and they named it the small core phenomenon. And other matching markets in the world basically show the same, but the core is very small. There are very few stable matchings. And there's also a theoretical theorem from 1984. It's called the Rural Hospital Theorem, which basically shows that in all stable allocations, the same set of students get matched. So, you know who is in all the possible stable allocations, the same students go to school. And essentially, they go to the same schools, right? There are very few students who go to different schools and still have an outcome which is stable. And this was a puzzle, right? I mean, why would this happen? Why not have many stable allocations? Theoretically, you can show there are exponentially many stable allocations. Why in every market that we try around the world, you only have a small number of stable allocations? Well, there are many theoretical explanations for this. One is that students don't really rank all the programs, they only give shortlists. There's an explanation which talks about correlation between different students, right? Everybody prefers the top universities. The strongest result is the imbalance result, which shows that the market is not imbalanced, so the number of students is not equal to the number of seats, then the core becomes very, very small. And there are a bunch of papers about that. And, there are many, many possible explanations, and it is even possible that, a subset of them is correct together. But the important insight is that it doesn't really matter which side proposes because the core is small, right? There's so few stable algorithms, stable matchings that, it doesn't matter if the colleges propose or the students propose, we're essentially going to get to the same outcome. Same set of kids are going to go to school. They're also going to go to the same schools. And being a computer scientist, this result is really depressing because, before all these results, we could do like a lot of crazy algorithms to look for many stable allocations and everything looked very interesting. But if all the stable allocations are actually very, very similar to one another, then why bother, right? Just use deferred acceptance and that's it. Okay, now in this talk, I want to show that if you make a small change, which actually happens in reality, all hell breaks loose and there's completely new world, and there's a lot of research to do. And the question that I want to study is what happens when there are fellowships, right? So when students go to school, usually you have fellowships that are given to a subset of the students. And what I want to show is that this actually is going to change everything that we had so far. And just to give like a short list of the results that we're going to show, we're going to show that deferred acceptance essentially allocates financial aid based on merit. So you ask yourself, who are the best students? And they're the ones who get the fellowship and not necessarily the ones who need it the most. The set of stable matchings is large. It's actually exponentially large. So you can think of it like an anti-Kojima-Patak result. So they show that this is really small. We show that it's huge. And more importantly, it's not just a theoretical result. We've actually ran this on the Hungarian market for college admissions. And you can see that there are real changes. So you can see that 10% of the students can change their allocations when you play a little bit with how you allocate the funding. And this is actually super important because it could also increase the size of the incoming cohort by 3%. Okay, so before we could say there's a very small number of students who change which school they go to, and you can never add a new student who doesn't go to school. In all possible stable allocations, the same set of students goes to school. And here we see that this is not the case. You can increase the number of students who go to school by about 3%. And 3%, if you have like 100,000 students a year, 3%, we're talking about 3,000 students who wouldn't go to school and now can go and get higher education. And we also show that there's substantial scope for manipulation by colleges. So before I told you that the students, they don't need to manipulate, this is truthful. The colleges can manipulate, but if there's so few stable allocations, then they cannot manipulate much. Here there are lots of stable allocations, so the colleges can actually manipulate, and we're going to see how. Okay, so these are really like big results. Let me start with a small warm-up proof, just to give you like an intuition of what's going on here. So imagine now that you have M students and N colleges, and the college's capacity is 1. Okay, so each college is only going to accept 1 student for a funded seat and 1 student for an unfunded seat. And any assignment is acceptable, so students would always want to go to school. They always prefer to not go to school, and colleges want to fill their classes, so no students is unacceptable. They want to get the best students, the students that they like most, but they'll take somebody. And again, this is just an example, right? All these things we can relax. We're going to relax later. And now another assumption I want to make is that agents prefer money. Okay, so students prefer getting paid as to not getting paid, but they care lexicographically more about the identity of their match partner, right? So if they need to choose, where they go to school is much more important than whether they get funding or not. And the claim is that twice the minimum of MN. Agents have multiple stable allocations, right? So what's going to happen here? So you're going to have like the students and the colleges. And since everybody is acceptable, then either 2 N students are going to study if you have enough rooms for everybody. Or, I'm sorry, if you don't have enough rooms for everybody, 2 N students are going to study, or M students are going to study, right? Because there is enough room for everybody. And the point is that now you can change twice the minimum of MN and have a different stable allocations. How do you do that? Just pick a stable allocation, okay? And you have like minimum MN agents match on each side. And now you can shift the money between the agents, right? So if 2 students go to some school, you can just change. If X used to get money and Y didn't, just give Y the money and don't give X the money. So each of X and Y change their allocation, right? Because now they have like a different funding term. So it's like a different contract, but it is still stable. And the reason it's still stable is because they don't want to go to another school, right? They don't really care so much about the money. They care much more about which school they go to. Okay, so this already shows us that there's something interesting going on, because almost, a huge number of students can change their allocation, and there's actually an exponential number of allocations because you can choose any subset of the pairs and flip them. So we've already shown exponential number of possible allocations in this very simple market. Now, this is not really interesting because, they basically go to the same school. So maybe we should say, it's not that important who gets the funding and who doesn't, but it already shows that there's something really interesting mathematically going on. And now we can start seeing what to do with this. Okay, so now I want to talk about deferred acceptance and show that this is basically giving the funding to the students who the schools like the most. Okay, so so I just want to say before we talk about this is that deferred acceptance is actually used in Hungary, Turkey, and Australia to assign students to universities. And in all these countries, what's happening is actually that the students who the school wants the most get the funding without noticing their financial status. And how does this work? So the way that it works is this. We assume that applicants always prefer to get funding versus not get funding, right? So maybe I want University A with funding, then University B with funding, and then University A without funding. That's okay. But I will never prefer University A without funding to University A with funding. That doesn't make any sense. And if I'm making this assumption, then the way to run deferred acceptance in these cases is basically to say, okay, let's treat University A as 2 universities, University A with funding and University A without funding. And now instead of having N colleges, I have 2 N colleges, right? Where again, each 2 fake colleges consisted of 1 real college. And then the students basically rank all the possible colleges where, again, they rank each college twice, 1 with funding and 1 without funding. And now I'm back to the original problem, and I can write deferred acceptance and basically assign students to colleges. Okay, and then if you run this, then the student, the colleges with the funding and the college without the funding, University A with funding, University A without funding, they're really the same universities, or they have the same preferences over the students. And therefore, students will always go to University A with funding before they go to University A without funding. And University A with funding is going to choose a student they like the most and send the other one away. So essentially, the students the universities like the most, they're the ones who get the funding. Let me give an example. And in this example, you'll also see what happens and how we can increase the number of students that study. So imagine that you have 1 college C with 2 seats and 1 scholarship, right? The simplest possible situation. And I also have 2 applicants, R, and you can think of R as a rich student, and P, and you can think of P as a poor student. So R prefers the funded seat to the unfunded seat. That's easy. Even though R is rich, they always prefer more money. So basically what we have is R prefers RF, R funded, to R funded, R unfunded, and they prefers that to not going to school, right? R would always want to go to school even if they don't get money. And P really needs the money. So P finds only the funded seat acceptable. If they don't get the funded seat, they go to school. They just don't go to school. So these would be the preferences of P. they prefer the funded seat, and then they prefer not to go to school, and they cannot go to school with the unfunded seat, right? So that's like the lowest possible thing. That's just not going to happen. And now imagine that the college prefers R to P. Okay, for some reason, this is what happened. So what is going to happen here, right? And here's an example, right? So the college prefers getting both students to getting one of them, but they prefer R to P. And since we're running the deferred acceptance, then what is going to happen is R and P are going to apply to the funded position of the college. The college prefers R to P, so R is going to keep the funding position, the funded position, and P is going to have to reapply, and P will apply to the unfunded, and P can apply to the unfunded position. Okay, so let's kind of see what happened. So here we have R who prefers RF to R funded to R unfunded to nothing, and we have P who prefers P funded to nothing. Okay, and they will never go to school if they don't get funding. And this is the college. And what would happen is basically this: R and P both compete for the funded position. R gets the funded position because the college prefers R to P, and then P doesn't go to compete for the unfunded position. P just goes home because, you know, if they don't get the funding, they don't want to study. So the stable outcome is basically going to be the red thing that you see here. R gets the funding, P gets nothing, and the college gets the rich student in the funded position. However, there's also there's another stable outcome in which R gets the unfunded position, P gets the funded position, and the college gets R is unfunded, it's P unfunded. And you can see that if you start from the blue allocation, from the stable outcome number 2, it is still stable, right? Because if R would say, "Dear college, can I get your funded position?" The college would say, "No, I prefer to keep you as unfunded and the poor student as funded to the option in which only you're studying and getting the funded position." And the poor students, of course, prefer this to not being funded at all. So this allocation is stable and is actually much better. If you think about it from a market perspective, it's a much better allocation because now 2 students get to go to school instead of just 1. This small example can also happen in some sense at random. Now I'm just going to state the result without proof. But we also show that if you have a large market, right, with n colleges and 2n students, and each college has 2 seats and 1 scholarship, so exactly what we had here. But now there's an arbitrary complete ranking over students, right? So I don't care what is the ranking. And the applicants, the students, have random rankings, right? So I don't have to cook anything here, right? The college's ranking can be adversarial. The students' ranking is randomized. So they basically just pick a bunch of colleges, like K colleges for some small number K, and just rank the contracts in these colleges in any way that they want, as long as they prefer the funded position to the unfunded position. Then there is a constant probability that something like this will happen. And there's a high probability that I'm going to have an exponential number of different allocations. And these allocations are going to vary in the number of students who get allocated, and order n students can be unallocated, or additional order n students can be allocated between different stable matchings. And I want to say that we've also generalized this. You could also have polarities, and you can assume that you have poor and rich students, or the programs have different quotas, not a quota of 1, and all these things, and markets can be unbalanced. Like, you can put all these things in the mix, and still you're going to get the same basic result, which is you have an exponential number of possible stable allocations, and the number of students who get allocated can be different by order n. And I'm not going to go over the proof, but this is really important. And also the proof shows that the expected fraction of colleges that can manipulate in deferred acceptance, there's an expected fraction of colleges, right? So order n colleges can manipulate, right? Essentially, any college which has 2 students who go to it, where 1 student is really sensitive to funding and the other is not, can manipulate. It's essentially the example that we've seen before. Okay, and this is sort of like the manipulation. If you want to do the manipulation, you basically need to collect information. So now colleges actually want to collect information, which they didn't do before. Okay, so this has been theoretical, but actually pretty robust. So when you see nice theoretical or robust results, you can try to see like what happens in real places. So we went to Hungary, and ask them for their college admission data. So in Hungary, colleges are centralized since around 1985, and you have about 100,000 applicants per year, and around 2,000 programs. And every year, about 80,000 applicants get admitted to universities. And just to give a few more numbers, the average rank order list is 4 countries with 3 programs. This is what students rank. About 60% of the students rank only funded seats, and about 40% rank both funded and unfunded. It is very common for students to put the funded seat directly above the unfunded seat in the same program, right? So exactly the thing we had before, where you have some students who say, I can only go to school if I get funding. And you have students who say, I really want this school, and I prefer getting funded to getting unfunded. But, you know, I would stay in this school even if I get it unfunded. You have like these 2 types of students, exactly what we said before, right? R and P, you actually have them in your life, and you have a lot of them. And when you have such a program with, you know, one student who really wants a program, either if they get funding or not, and another student who wants the program only for funding, the program has market power of these students, right? So if the program allocates the funding to one of the students, they can get both of them. And if they allocate to the other, you'll only get one student. So this is basically what we did. And here you have the benchmark is the student proposing deferred acceptance. So you have 84,000 students which are being accepted to universities, and we've changed the algorithm and the way we do the funding, and we managed to get around 85,847 students allocated who are going to get admitted to the universities. So as you can see, between SPDA, which is number 2 here, and number 5, which is the algorithm which allocates the funding in a smart way to the students who need it the most, you can see that about 1,700 students, additional 1,700 students go to school. And the way that works is there really changes, right? So there are about 5,200 winners, so students who now go to school and couldn't go to school before, but there are also losers, right? So there are about 4,700 losers, students who used to go to school and now don't go. I should say that I should be a little bit more careful. Winners are either students who didn't go to school and now go to school, or students who improved their position. And losers are students who basically decrease their position, right? So they used to get a nice seat, and now they get maybe the seat in the same university, but it's unfunded, so they lost something from the change. So you see that about 10,000 students change something, either won or lost. And the outcome of this is that 1,700 new students get to go to school, which is, and in this example, about 2%. Here, 10% of the students change their allocation. Who are the winners and the losers, right? So I'm not going to go over everything, but basically I just wanted to notice that the students who win more are the students from towns and villages, and students who have lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and the students from the county capitals. And the capitals seem to lose from this, right? Because they used to get funded positions, and now they're getting unfunded positions. So they actually lose because of this change. But again, in addition to the fact that winners and losers, there's also a huge net gain of 1,700 new students who otherwise couldn't go to school and now can go to school. And here there are more numbers. Basically, unemployment rate is important. Gross annual per capita income is important. We basically see that, you know, it's not just we're helping 1,700 students, we're also helping the students from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's exactly the people who we want to help. Conclusions. So first, some theoretical conclusions. College admission market typically have many stable allocations. One means in funding, in which you actually have funding in truth. And deferred acceptance allocates funding based on merit. But if you do something smarter, which basically allocates the funding based on need and not merit, so you see which students come from a weaker socioeconomic background and make sure that they get the funding, you can make huge differences. And at least in the case, you have like provable guarantees if you do this for random markets. And at least in the case of Hungary, you can increase the size of the incoming class by 2%, which is huge, right? 1,700 new students who get to go to school every year. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Avinatan, for that interesting presentation and all the work that you're doing. I'm going to see if there are any questions. So if anyone from the audience has questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And while we wait for questions, I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on sort of in terms of next steps and promising directions that you see here at this interface of, allocation and mechanism design education. What are some topics that come to mind for you, and what do you see as the sort of big challenges?
Okay, so first, I think that we're just scratching the surface on the things that can happen. I mean, the fact that there are multiple different allocations is huge. It means that we need new algorithms to find them. Right now, what we did was like simulations, but we had all the data. We want to find something which is, sort of an criteria which makes sense, in which you can squeeze the good allocations, right? Because there's a huge difference. But the way we did was, post-based, where we had like all the preferences of everybody. Everybody was truthful because they were playing deferred acceptance. And then we did the manipulation. This doesn't make sense. We really need an algorithm which would be able to put more students in the university, but still be truthful. And to me, this is a huge question that, we don't really know what to do with it. There are other questions. Sometimes you don't have a centralized market. You have a decentralized market. We know that deferred acceptance is a good proxy for what would happen in the end when you have a decentralized market. How can we change the rules of the market, keeping it decentralized, and get to a better allocation where more kids go to school? More kids go to school, more students go to university, doesn't matter, right? It's the same thing again and again. How do we define what we do with funding? What should be the rules? What should be the guidelines? All these things can have a huge effect. Another question that I think is really important is interviews. Students who come from weaker backgrounds sometimes are less able to interview. So if we understand better interviews and how we should allocate them and how we should think of them, again, we can help more students go to school and find a better allocation, which would be better for society.
That makes a lot of sense. And from, so all these questions that you mentioned, right, all these decisions that have to be made, a lot of them in mechanism design are made in a very top-down way, right? You have some sort of designer or someone, even in a decentralized setting, you still have this very top-down way of trying to understand the scope of the problem and what we should be optimizing for and what our criteria are. Do you see opportunities for matching and mechanism design to also integrate questions and preferences and constraints and sort of desires in a bottom-up way for families to contribute that, not just by mentioning their preferences, which we've studied to death, right? But just preferences for what they get, as individuals, but also what outcomes they would like to see, what objectives we should be optimizing for, things like that. So do you see an opportunity for a more bottom-up way?
So, yeah, absolutely. So actually what happened when we did the law match in Israel, so, we couldn't get lawyers to agree to use this. And we're also very afraid they're going to sue us. So we're very, very careful in what we're doing. So effectively, this has no legal implications. Under a different matching system, what we had in Israel was basically a recommendation system. So people would just voluntarily log into the system with their preferences, and the law offices would also voluntarily log into the system with their preferences, and they don't have to do it. And we would compute a stable allocation and tell it to them. And then they would basically make phone calls and sign deals and do everything according to what we tell them, but they don't have to do this. And the nice thing is that it's given that the mechanism exists, it's a dominant strategy to participate. So they all participate, even though they don't have to do this. And once we tell them, we've computed a stable allocation, these are the people you should call. And they know that everybody else follows the stable allocation. It's also a dominant strategy for them to follow it. So they also follow it. So this is a situation which is completely bottom up. We have no market power, and we're able to do this. And once you're able to do this, then you immediately have power because you're the one who's making the recommendations and people know how to trust you. And then you can start playing and give intelligent recommendations, right? So you can play with things like which salary the offices can pay to the lawyers. These are, entry-level lawyers, right? They don't make a lot of money. But if the offices are willing to pay different levels of salary, you can somehow play games and try to match students who need the money more with offices who pay more based on this type of result. So we actually have a chance. I think that as designers, we have much more power than we think. partly because people are willing to listen to us, and we can like create consensus between separate parties, so universities or whatever we find. And even if they're not listening to us, the information itself and the fact that we have these amazing mathematical tools can actually make a change in the real world.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Avinatan.